afternoon and welcome everyone to this event organized by the International Crisis Group. My name is Pierre Prakash. I'm the director of the Asia program at Crisis Group based here in Bangkok, and I have to say it's a pleasure to see so many of you assembled today for what promises to be a very interesting and a very timely conversation about the evolving security order in the Indo-Pacific. And when I say timely, I'm of course referring to both developments in this region, but also developments underway in the Middle East, which of course have implications for this region and for some of the actors that we will be talking about today. I will keep this very short because the objective of this event is really for you to be able to benefit from the insights of our analysts from Crisis Group who are gathered here today. But I just wanted to say a few words of introduction about our organization. For those of you who may not be entirely familiar with our work, we are a policy-oriented advocacy organization that focuses on conflict prevention and conflict resolution. We have a network of analysts based around the world, based in the countries that they cover or the sub-regions that they cover, because our research methodology is firmly anchored in field research. Which means we need to be able to talk to the conflict actors themselves, the people affected by the conflict, and peripheral actors as well, donors, the diplomatic community in a given country, for example. And that allows this field presence and us being on the ground like this really allows us to develop policy recommendations which are pragmatic for those that can influence the course of a conflict. And that would be everything from governments, armed groups, donors, etc., policymakers of various kinds. And of course, since we're at the FCCT, I would also like to mention the media in that list with whom we collaborate very closely. In Asia, we have a team of around 15 analysts around the region who cover a wide range of conflicts. I think many of you in the room would actually be familiar with some of our work on Myanmar or on Thailand's Deep South or the peace process in the southern Philippines, for example. But we're also increasingly keeping up with the times in a sense, looking at what I would call bigger picture analysis, global geopolitics, but also regional dynamics. And that's what brings us today, that's what brings me to the event today. The event we are holding this afternoon stems from a series of reports that we are in the process of publishing that each individual report looks into how countries in the region, particularly U.S. allies, are shifting or recalibrating their defense postures in order to be better equipped to deal with the current circumstances and particularly a fast-evolving geopolitical landscape globally and regionally. As I mentioned, our model implies that we are actually field-based, all of us, so it's very rare to have so many of us in the same room, I have to say. And it's even more rare to have the pleasure of having our president and CEO, Dr. Comfort Aero, who is here with us today. Comfort is constantly traveling the world, conducting public and private advocacy with politicians, policymakers, once again, all of those who can influence the course of the conflicts we work on. And so thank you, Comfort, for making the time to be here with us today. As you can imagine, given the state of the world, Comfort is quite busy, so it was a bit of a challenge. And without further ado, I would like to invite our president to give a few introductory remarks before we kick off the panel discussion. Thank you for your attention. And Comfort, please, over to you.
Thanks, Pierre. I think there are other people who are busier than me, journalists and diplomats who are constantly having to grapple with the world. It's a real pleasure for me to return to Bangkok. My first time here was in 2013 when I met Matt Wheeler, and then I had the pleasure of coming back, but this time to Phuket, where the Asia team had its retreat. But thank you all for joining us this afternoon in your busy schedule. It's pretty gratifying, at least for me. And it's always a pleasure to be able to come out to the region when there's an opportunity as well. So really, on behalf of Crisis Group and all of us, really, it's quite spectacular to see the turnout here this afternoon. Pierre hinted at it as well, but the timing of the launch, I've been pressuring the Asia program to prepare to launch the report, but I did not realize it was going to coincide with such a seismic change of events in the international arena. So it's quite fortuitous to be launching a package of the series. There's still some more to come, but the timing could not be more important given the current global trend lines and the impact that it's obviously having in the Asia-Pacific region as well. And across a lot of the region, whether it's Europe, Crisis Group's headquarters is based in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and across other parts of the world. Crisis Group, the core of our work is crisis prevention. And the byline says preventing war, shaping peace. And we've been a firm believer in maintaining the balance between communication and deterrence. And we see conflict prevention and deterrence as tightly interlinked as well. We don't see them as separate pillars. But if you're serious about prevention, that does require a degree of deterrence in that work. But I'll be the very first one to say to you that the core of our mandate, the essence of what we do, which is to think about diplomacy, preventative diplomacy, is being challenged in a number of arenas. And of course, the biggest arena today is what's happening in the Middle East with the U.S. Israeli war in Iran as well. And even before that, it was already under a great deal of challenge. Okay. That's so kind of you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And as I was saying, the greatest challenge for Crisis Group is that the core of our mandate is conflict prevention, and everywhere I turn, the core of that mandate is being tested severely. Whether it's in the Middle East, in Europe, where we see the return of war in Ukraine, in Latin America, where we're seeing gang violence, drug wars in Haiti, in Mexico, in Colombia, or whether it's in Africa, where we're seeing one of the world's largest humanitarian crisis and conflicts return in Sudan and in the Sahel as well. So in each region where we work, we see our mandate severely tested as well. But the core for us is communication, is dialogue, and it's also deterrence, which brings me to our Asia work and the work that my colleagues have been doing on the militarization on the high seas of Asia. And actually, one of the lessons I learned is that the choice of words that you use to describe something matters. So whenever, at least a good example is when I was with Georgi in the Philippines, and the language that was used to me in the Philippines was that this is not militarization, this is about modernization. Modernization of our defense architecture at a time of significant global change and geopolitical tensions. And of course, the biggest geopolitical tension, which I think is shaping the choices of a number of Asian countries, is the US-China competition, or assumptions that have been made about what will underpin that US-China competition. And it's also fortuitous that we're doing this launch at the time of apparently two significant visits that will take place. We assume that the visit of the new Prime Minister of Japan will continue to take place this Thursday. And despite what we saw this morning, we also assume, until we're definitely told otherwise, that the summit between Presidents Trump and Xi will take place as well. So it's really great for me to be able to finally see the outgrowth of our work, headlined by our Deputy Director, Huong, who's going to lead our discussions today. I think one of the concerns and one of the reasons why we chose to make this investment is, number one, our own co-chair, when she met the co-chair of Crisis Group's board, Susanna Malcora, when she met the Asia team and she listened to the various analysis from our colleagues from Afghanistan right to Taiwan, her message to the team and to me was that it's very clear to us that this is the era of Asia geopolitics, and that Crisis Group needed to ramp up its own investment in Asia, take seriously the calculations of the key countries, not just China and not just the US-China competition, but the regional alliances, the decisions, the calculations that countries are making between themselves and as a result of the US-China competition. So it's on that basis that we took this heavy investment to understand the choices that states are making within that wider global politics, but also within their own particular tensions as well. So a pleasure to see all of you here, and I'm going to hand over to our moderator for the next few hours. Really glad that you can join us, May, and to save the gentleman from coming over here again, I will swap the names around and put you on the podium in front of me. So thank you so much for also agreeing to moderate us this afternoon as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Comfort, and I'm glad that I don't need to have someone crawling under me to put up my nameplate. Thank you very much indeed. Just give me a second here while I get my laptop working. Pardon me here. It's not cooperating, and I'm the journalist here. Excuse me. I do beg your pardon. Give me a second.
Take your time, man.
Apologies. I don't know why my laptop is just not working. I do have that, but yes, please. I'm sorry. Why don't we go ahead first? Yeah, I'll have Huong. She's going to give a little bit of a background as to why we're having this particular event today, and also, you know, why it's important and why it's so timely. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Good afternoon. It's great to be with you today. This is my first time at the Foreign Club, Correspondent Club in Thailand, in Bangkok. So it's great to see the faces that are, from what I understand, are regular here. As both Comfort and Pierre explained, it is very timely that we are here today to talk about the geopolitics of a broader Asia or Indo-Pacific. But the series we are bringing to you actually had been in our thinking for a little bit longer than just the current events, and it just happened that our work is even more so relevant today. We are talking about a body of work that showcases the change of balance of power in Asia. We're looking at the military competition between the US and China, which is the first of our opening chapeau of the series. You can find the prints of the reports at the front desk. And we are looking at the allies of United States, the consequential middle powers in the region, so Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines in that case. Why, and especially we wanted to explain why today launching it in Thailand, which is another ally of United States, but we haven't had a special report dedicated to it, is because the very original idea behind the series is that we detected the change, the balance of power. We detected certain activism among certain countries, the countries that we mentioned and are listed in the special series. and their appetite to modernize their military, play a stronger role in the security order, and actually reshaping the regional order because of that. So that's what is the background of our special report series. And my colleagues and I will take turn in diving into each specific reports from now on. May, are you ready? Or shall we
Yes,
start?
I will go ahead right now. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for that. Apologies for the interruption earlier, but I just wanted to introduce myself as well. My name is May Huong, and I'm the Indochina Bureau Chief for the Straits Times, a Singapore flagship daily paper. And as you've heard from both Comfort as well as from Huong over here, we are in the midst of extreme conditions today when we are talking about security, when we're talking about defense, as well as military operations in the world today. Now, as we gather here, we're also witnessing this very concerning development in Middle East, as you all well know. And we're looking at the fact that this war is no longer just confined to the Middle East. We're also looking at the fact that it's spilling over into Southeast Asia, into Asia. Now, we're seeing Asian countries also prior to that, like China, Japan, the Philippines, increase their military spending and revise their defense policies to deal with a more uncertain landscape today. So just to give you an example as well, Japan in December allocated a record $58 billion for its defense budget in this fiscal year, and that is a whopping 9.4% more than the last budget in defense spending. So this is a clear sign that countries are beefing up their self-reliance. And when it comes to defense, security, and military capabilities today, we have 4 experts here to talk about that. First of all, I'd like to introduce, to my right here is Georgi. And Georgi Engelbrecht is the senior analyst for the Philippines. Next, we have Matt Wheeler. He's the senior analyst for Southeast Asia. And of course, we had Huong Lei-tu, which is the Deputy Director for the Asia Program. And last but not least, we have Christopher Green, the Senior Consultant looking at the Korean Peninsula. Now, let us kick off with this discussion because there is a lot to cover, and you guys can think about some of the questions that you may have for them later on as well. Now, first of all, I'd like to actually turn to you, Matt, if I may, to talk about the current situation where we're looking at Japan. You recently wrote an article about the upcoming visit by Japan's Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi. And obviously, as Comfort said earlier, hopefully it's going to take place on March 19th. And we're seeing the fact that the US and Japan relations has gone to a different level right now. You see Japan also trying to rethink and recalibrate its thoughts regarding the military. So in this sense, how would you kind of describe the Japanese reconciliation in terms of its independence on the US with Washington's retreat from withholding or rather upholding the post-war international order?
Yeah, thank you, May. I mean, it's a bind for Japan because since 2012, Japanese leaders have really made an effort to double down on their alliance with the United States, which is the foundation of Japan's security policy. And they're doing this to cope with what they perceive to be a much more dangerous region that they live in because of China's growing military power, because of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile capabilities, because of Russia's greater activities in the region and its cooperation with both the PRC and North Korea. But the alliance is only one part of Japan's strategy for its safety and for its prosperity. Japan is very serious about what it calls a rules-based international order grounded in international law. Japan, as a maritime trading nation, takes this very seriously. So we're at a moment where there's definitely tension between the reliance on the U.S. Security guarantee on the one hand, and this desire to uphold a rules-based international order. which is the foundation of Japan's vision for the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific. So the nature of U.S. policy in the second Trump administration, I think, has certainly given Tokyo some cause for concern, threatening the sovereignty of allied nations, using force to change the status quo in Iran. This doesn't sit easily with Japan's emphasis on a rules-based order. I think back to 2024 when then Prime Minister Fumio Kishida gave a speech to Congress in the United States. And he said he wanted to speak to those Americans who felt a sense of exhaustion and loneliness from having to uphold the international order more or less alone. And he said that Japan is prepared to bear more of that burden to uphold the international order, so the United States doesn't have to do it alone. And yet now we're in a situation where the United States seems to be turning its back on that order, doesn't have an interest in upholding it anymore, but it remains important to Japan's policy. So Japan has been in the process of modernizing its military for many years now. That reached, I think, a higher level in December 2022 with new national security strategy, national defense strategy, and a build-up program. Importantly, Japan scrapped its informal cap of 1% of GDP for defense spending, raised it to 2%, and it's my understanding that Japan has this month reached that 2% level, or is very close to doing so at this stage. Japan has acquired long-range precision strike missiles, which is a big departure for Japan. This is actually an offensive capability, but they call it counter-strike, and it will allow Japan to hit targets in mainland China. Japan has been, as I said, doubling down on the alliance, trying to further integrate with US forces in Japan, particularly in the realm of command and control. And Japan has also been diversifying its security partnerships, so developing much closer security relationships with Australia in particular, also the Philippines, and countries further afield in Europe and with NATO. Now these relationships are not ever going to be a substitute for the US alliance. In fact, in the same way that Japan developing greater military capabilities is a way to prove to the United States that it can be a reliable partner and ally, these diversified security relationships all have the US as a player in some respect, because these are US allies that Japan is partnering with. So these are all efforts to keep the United States engaged and to keep it active in the region. So there's a kind of a paradoxical quality, because the things that Japan might do to hedge against abandonment by the United States, developing greater military capability, developing security partnerships with states that are not the United States, are also things that the United States would like to see Japan do. And there's another, I think, important aspect to Japan's, or perceptions in Tokyo of the alliance with the United States, and that is that if there are doubts about the reliability of the United States commitment, it just doesn't do to talk about them publicly. Why? Because the alliance is about deterrence. So if you're voicing doubts about the United States, you're going to weaken deterrence. And so that's something that policymakers in Japan will avoid at all costs. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come back to Japan later on as well. But just beside Japan, we're looking at South Korea, of course, and that's also another important ally of the United States. South Korea recently also upped its defense spending by almost 8% to almost $45 billion US. And Chris, if I can ask you to just give us an idea of how South Korea's security environment today really somewhat has changed over the past 5 years. We've seen presidents change as well. So how has that changed, and why is it prompting them to pump in more funds into the defense sector?
Okay, thank you. Before we talk about 5 years ago, let's talk about 1949 for a second. I have a very close and wise associate in South Korea who said to me recently his father had been a senior Korean official in the Shanghai Provisional Government against the Japanese imperial period. And he said to me that his father, in 1949, you may not remember this, in 1949, the US actually withdrew from Korea for the only time in post-war Korean history. They were gone for a short period, and that was part of, not the whole reason, but part of the reason why North Korea was emboldened to attack South Korea in the following year, June 1950. So that associate of mine, through his relationship with his father, is aware of what a crisis looks like in Korea, and he feels like there is a great crisis somewhere out there on the horizon coming their way. So he thinks there's the great crisis coming, and this report, which is coming out very soon, all being well, goes some way to explaining why that is. If we now go back to your question and come back to the more recent past, if we think back to 2016-17, we had North Korea conducting multiple nuclear tests, refining their delivery systems very successfully over a 2-year period. And that was the period of so-called fire and fury, another great quote from you-know-who. And then in 2018, we pivoted to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, and there was a period of great dialogue between the US and North Korea and South Korea alongside that. Of course, that died in 2019 with the Hanoi summit, and then another meeting in Stockholm at the end of the year, but there was no further diplomacy after that. And then, of course, the black swan event of the pandemic came along. Coming out of the pandemic, it was clear that North Korea had made some significant strategic decisions about its future, and they would have very significant ramifications into the present and the coming years. South Korea's current issue set now, due to these changes in the geopolitical environment, North Korea is certainly more hostile politically to South Korea than it had been before the beginning of 2024. And North Korea is arguably stronger militarily, certainly in some ways it is. North Korea has been expanding its nuclear arsenal, in particular since 2023, when Kim Jong-un ordered that particular additional efforts be made in this direction. Not only that, it's, as I say, it has improved its delivery systems, and it's working on multiple independent re-entry vehicles for its missiles as well, and to have a nuclear-capable submarine capability too. All of this has the potential, of course, to complicate missile defense. At the same time, Russia has become a new strategic supporter of Pyongyang, trading on the benefits of the Ukraine conflict, of course. That military cooperation is a little opaque to us, but certainly includes assistance with North Korea's satellite launch capabilities, ballistic missile capabilities, and the mutual defense treaty between Russia and North Korea signed in the summer of 2024. And at the same time, China continues to sustain the North economically and support it politically in a way that it was not doing in 2016, 2017. So we can see that the threat environment on the Korean Peninsula has worsened, and at the same time, as your introductory remarks made clear, US-China competition's intensifying, US pressure on one side, Chinese pressure on the other, leaving South Korea, and North Korea for that matter, in the middle. Now, of course, South Korea has always been on a geopolitical fault line, but the geopolitical fault line is now experiencing, shall we say, more tremors than normal, making that position on a geopolitical fault line even more risky than it already was. The implications of all this, the US-South Korea alliance remains a vital tool of South Korea's defense, but it's a less predictable one. Under Presidents Biden and Yoon Song-yeol, who was indeed, of course, impeached, but in the area of his relationship with President Biden and the rapprochement with Japan in 2022, he achieved some significant diplomatic gains. Under those two presidents, the alliance was stabilized after the first Trump administration, but the second Trump administration has revived these concerns, which never really went away but were ameliorated. Concerns about alliance reliability, of course. We can talk about troop hosting costs as an area of past tension. That was a Trump 1 issue that could easily come back. The repurposing of US forces Korea for strategic flexibility reasons is a current issue. And then there's also the ever-present possibility of talk of troop force reductions on the part of USFK. So for South Korea, it's a mixed picture, actually, because South Korea no longer really fears abandonment by the United States, because South Korea has emerged as a very important strategic bridgehead for South Korea, for the United States, apologies, on the continental mainland, which it always was, but now that US-China competition is intensifying as it is, that bridgehead becomes all the more vital. So there's no fear of abandonment, but with the diminishing fear of abandonment, there is the fear of entrapment. USFK is being repurposed for strategic flexibility, as I said, and that means there is more opportunity, bad opportunities, but opportunities nevertheless, for being entrapped in conflicts that South Korea has no interest in and no desire to be entrapped in either. South Korea's strategy for responding to this is, okay, South Korea has been modernizing its military for a long time, and it's engaging in strategic hedging to try and manage its difficult position in the region. Defense spending has been rising for a long time, but as you say, it's rising now faster than before. Of course, South Korea has made a commitment, like so many others, to reach 3.5% of GDP on defense over the medium term, from a very high base in the first place in South Korea's case, because the North Korean threat is, of course, long-standing. South Korea has also become one of the world's top 10 arms exporters, partly to try and fund those military development projects for its own domestic purposes, which comes at a cost too, brings some risks of its own. So anyway, what we are facing, based on this history, going back to 1949, but specifically 2016, is a US-South Korea alliance that is vital but less predictable, and South Korea's military modernization process is designed to deal with some of the limitations of that, whilst also using wise diplomacy to try and reduce the tensions and the heat in the regional atmosphere.
Thank you, Chris. The use of diplomacy, I just want to come to Philippines right now, moving closer to this particular region. We are seeing also the fact that, Chris was talking about South Korea having the threat worsening in the northern peninsula. We're talking about Chris saying that South Korea is not fearing abandonment. But what about the Philippines? We're talking about the South China Sea. That's a major issue for the Philippines and for this particular region. And as you know, you're an expert, you've done a lot of research on the Philippines. Manila has long been preoccupied with fighting internal conflicts with the insurgents. But now we're looking at President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. having Manila really shift its attention, its security focus, to more of an external focus at this point in time because of what I just said earlier. So tell us, what are the implications for Manila's modernization efforts?
Yeah, thank you for this. Well, let me just start with by asking or by proposing a question to you. What is the story of the Philippines? Now, as you said, in history, it has been, of course, often a story about conflict, but also peace, as we have seen actually in the last years, that raised that question that our report also looked into. But apart from that, it also remains, as to quote, a very strategic piece of real estate. So how can these two things be reconciled? Well, for one, it is absolutely true that we did see a relative improvement of domestic security in the Philippines. So if we look at the two main issues that we've observed, the oldest communist insurgency in Asia is still not entirely gone, But according to government forces and figures, we only have less than 1,000 armed fighters left, which allowed the Philippine military to consider it not as a key threat as it used to. And on the other hand, we still have a very fragile but still existing peace agreement in the southern Philippines, in Mindanao, that has also been, according to our assessment, one of the few agreements that is actually still not breaking down, even though it has certainly its challenges. So the Philippine effort to do something about the external focus has also been not quite entirely new, because as early as 2014, there was this realization we should actually focus on the outside. But it was overtaken by events, and we had different factors that made that pivot not appear, actually. But what we see now is a real effort by the president, by the defense establishment, in terms of policy, resources, and strategic thinking, and calculating what needs to be done in order to get away from this internal preoccupation. And that mostly happens through three ways that we've analyzed and tried to describe in our reporting. It is about strategic culture, it is about acquisition, and it's also about what Matt mentioned earlier. It's about diversification and partnerships. Neither of the three probably is an entire surprise, of course. So on the first one, it is interesting that initially President Marcos also really recognized the importance of diplomacy with Beijing. But ultimately, we have also seen that since the internal landscape slightly stabilized and the maritime dispute at sea did not really stop despite his efforts to find a diplomatic arrangement, he was forced to think differently. And in the Philippines, a key term, and the country loves abbreviations, what we had was the so-called CATSI, or the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept, which is a very interesting word, perhaps not fully sorted out what exactly it means, but we're basically talking about Philippine strategic thinking to access its exclusive economic zone, and to make sure that every top commander at the higher level in the armed forces will not be preoccupied with chasing Maoist rebels, but rather thinking about options for deterrence. Even though in our research, I think I came to the conclusion that deterrence might also lie actually in the eyes of the beholder, because it may different means even within the Philippines as well, depending on who you ask. So that strategic change has really been there for more than 1.5 years now. The key question is, what is really happening on the ground? It is one thing to write a policy paper, to develop a concept, but it's different to really do the things that are needed. And there I think we have to remember that the Philippines baseline is obviously not quite the same as what Korea has or Japan, because just 10 or 15 years ago, the only navy in the Philippines were 3 decommissioned US Coast Guard cutters, and that's about it. So even if we say the Philippines, notwithstanding its acquisitions, its effort to invest also resources that are scarce, we are seeing an improvement in terms of the baseline compared to the past. We've now investments for the first time into air defense systems. We have more capable fighter jets. We have also the famous BrahMos missile that itself cannot really make probably a dent, but the idea of the Philippines so far is to complicate a situation that might emerge at sea. And I think that is also something that actually counts. The third part of that is, of course, the partnerships that exist. And as of now, the Philippines, one of the oldest allies of the United States, has a variety of instruments to count on. So one is, of course, the Mutual Defense Treaty, but we have also seen the implementation of the Enhanced Defensive Cooperation Agreement, the EDCA, that again was actually developed 2014, but for different reasons, including domestic politics and the return of internal threats, has postponed that idea. And discussions on these bases that give US troops rotational access but are still Filipino, that discussion actually started already in the last year of President Rodrigo Duterte, who by all means was not a friend of the United States. And I think in our reporting, we've also tried to highlight that even a relatively pro-Beijing president as him has realized we cannot really put our eggs in one basket, and we need to go back to the alliance with the US that we have. That finally happened around the time of the pandemic. So for now, we see the return of US Navy troops to Mindanao. We've seen more and more exercises that are going on. But in the Philippines, you also don't forget what happened at the Scarborough Shoal 2012. This is, I'm not quite sure if it would count as trauma in that sense, but I think the strategic elites certainly remember that. And this is also the reason why it doesn't hurt to continue to engage in the alliance, but it's also important to look up, and we have Japan there, and go down, and this is Australia. And beyond that, the Philippines, as a very, using a very diplomatic approach, tries to make friends along the way almost everywhere, in ASEAN, in Europe, in Canada, and I think all of that also leads to defense agreements and exercises in order to prepare Philippine troops for possible contingencies. Because again, if you're now newly assigned as lieutenant colonel or brigadier general somewhere, the message from the top is clear. You need to be ready for everything, and you should spend your time with not only thinking about insurgents, but of course other possible contingencies. But of course it's still a long way to go, because funding has always been an issue, and for now the Philippines has roughly spent between 1 and 1.4% of GDP on defense, was not publicly pressured by the United States to do more, although it knows it would like to. And there's some other gaps perhaps that the strategic establishment still tries to fill. For example, what is actually our end state in the South China Sea? Do we want to stop Chinese coercion? Do we want to keep the status quo? Or do we actually want to exploit our resources that are there that we cannot at the moment? Do we do it with the ally? Do we do it with other allies or other friends? So these are still questions, I think, that are out there, and perhaps we can also talk about this a bit later.
Absolutely. Georgi, as you mentioned earlier, we've looked at Japan, we've looked at Korea, now we're coming down, Philippines, and now further down south to Australia. Now, Huong, I want to bring you into this conversation right now. We're talking about Australia, which is not involved in any active conflicts right now. We've heard Japan, we've heard Korea, we've heard the Philippines. They're engaged in various geopolitical tensions. But Australia in itself is not, and it's geographically pretty far down south. And so if you can explain to us, if we're talking about the country's sense of threat, it's rather pronounced. And you recently, you were in Canberra, you were in Australia, and you met up with Foreign Minister Penny Huong as well. So give us a sense and tell us what exactly is behind this assessment of threat by Australia.
Thank you, May. And this ties to what my other colleagues have said about the respective countries. So what is another common denominator? Not only that everyone is being an ally of United States, but the other common denominator is some sort of shared threat perception to various degrees and priorities, but everybody's concern is China and China's rise, China's role in the region, how that shapes or reshapes the stability and regional security. And that is why Australia finds itself in the picture, because the sense of threat that China poses to the regional order that Australia knows and has benefited from is very pronounced. Australia prides itself for being a good ally of United States. In fact, it is used to having a big and powerful friends, first United Kingdom and then United States, because it's of its geography, precisely that. It's far away from China, it doesn't share border, it doesn't have active disputes, and it could choose the path of keeping an arm's length with the regional hotspots. But why it cares is because the regional or global order, based on rules-based order, or however you define it, has been something that Australia has been engaged since World War II, since U.S. unipolar moment and primacy, and Australia has benefited from that, both from security perspective, but also economic perspective. So it is in its interest to defend that order and make sure that the major disruption to it does not happen. But Australia's conundrum, both its biggest assets and biggest worry, is precisely its geography. It's far away from the direct threat, but at the same time, it is also a risk of being abandoned because of the distance. The tyranny of distance is there. In Australia's most recent strategic documents, a number of them, the Canberra government described the current environment as the most challenging and most fast-changing environment since World War II. And it is a global outlook. We can see the trend of global militarization around the globe with active conflicts in Ukraine, in the Middle East, but also a stable and quite significant trend of militarization in Asia. Now, it is quite stark for a country like Australia to identify such threat perception, and it also said that the modern threat is no longer limited by geography and distance. So the threats that are related to cyber, to means of posing challenges and disruption, is no longer shielded by the geography and distance, and that's why you see that major shift in Australia's recognition of the security environment it is. In fact, if you recall, U.S. ban on Huawei, it was actually Australia that the first imposed the 5G ban on Huawei. It was Australia that was very, very vocal about China's violations of human rights in Xinjiang, Tibet, and also inquiries to the origins of the COVID. Now, that didn't end up well, of course. So Australia has suffered a period of very tense relations with China, resulting to so-called diplomatic freeze that only amplify that sense of threat and change of environment, diplomatic environment that we are working on. And also what relates to that is also sense of economic security being challenged by great powers. So it's not only military threat perception. In fact, if you talk to Canberrans, very few would think that they would become a direct target of Chinese or any other revisionist power, as they name them. But there is, of course, a liability being which is hosting a joint facilities with United States. That comes in a package of being an ally. That comes also with benefits of shared intelligence and other, of course, defense coordination, interoperability, and access to, of course, the most modern hardware. Now, again, coming back to the issue of geography, because this is really what determines Australia's personality, strategic personality, and strategic thinking. Australia's in the period of reckoning, I think most profound since the European settlement, in fact, because it finds itself among Asian partners and neighbors with whom it shares some interests, but not necessarily values. So it does feel a certain level of loneliness. It does feel challenging to accommodate a growing regional power, which is China, and it is probably very hard to imagine being a part of a region that would be dominated by China. That's why it is in Australia's interest to keep United States engaged. Australia is very keen to keep U.S. engaged, willing to pay extra premium. You might have heard about a project called AUKUS, the biggest defense investment in country's history. Is a result of trilateral defense pact between Australia, UK, and United States that came just around during the COVID time in 2021. And within this AUKUS, among others, is a vision of Australia acquiring a nuclear-propelled submarines from United States, and at latest in the 2030s, and in the later stage, even co-developing with UK, a new AUKUS-class submarines in the 2040s. So Australia's investing massive $300-something billion into this, which is likely to balloon over the years, with the hope that those submarines will actually arrive to deter what it wants to deter right now. But that shows you the sense of insecurity that the country has, and that sense of the need of investment in its own defense, in conjunction, again, doubling down on the ally of United States and UK. And the final point I will make about geography is that Australia plays an important role in the region when you see its immediate neighbors, which is Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I mentioned that Australia is undergoing a strategic personality shift. So from a very Anglo legacy culture with being allied with UK and now United States, it is going to embrace its regional identity, which is a Pacific nation. And it also feels greater responsibility for its immediate neighborhood, which is the Pacific Islanders, and also Southeast Asia. In fact, Australia plays a role as a security provider, limited, of course, given its size and capability, but it does provide security to Southeast Asia and the Pacific by the means of training, capacity building. In fact, in one of the latest Lowy poll, Australia ranked second most preferred partner in terms of military training after the United States. So its reputation, its role in the region may be limited, but it's quite important, especially under the current foreign policy of the United States, where Southeast Asia or the Pacific don't seem to feature at all in President Trump's foreign policy priorities. And hence, Australia may appear, at least in certain limited way, as a key player in the region, at least this Pacific side of the region. Maybe I'll stop here and then we can engage more.
Sure. And obviously, Australia, like many other countries, are also trying to enhance its role of being a middle power in today's context. Matt, I want to bring you back in here again, given the fact that we are here in Thailand and in Southeast Asia. But as I mentioned earlier from the get-go, is the war in the Middle East is not just confined to that particular region, it's spilling over here. Now the question is, if the Americans were to ask help from Japan, South Korea, even from the other allies such as Thailand, how do you think countries are going to respond, given the fact that the Americans have already asked for ships to be sent in to the Strait of Hormuz, but at this moment, you've seen Japan saying, no, not really, we're going to hold off, and likewise for South Korea at this point. So how do you think Asian countries are going to respond as this war continues?
Well, as you say, we have some intimation now of what the response is going to be. We always knew it was going to be cautious under these circumstances. Yeah, the United States and Israel launched this war without building a coalition. Certainly, Donald Trump led us to believe that this would be easy and quick, and so didn't plan for the contingencies that we're seeing now. And I mean, I can speak to the Japan case, and my colleagues can talk about the countries that they've been working on. But like I said, Japan was always going to be cautious, and its officials have said that there are very high hurdles to deploying the Japanese self-defense forces. So in 2015, there was new peace and security legislation which in theory would allow Japan to deploy its self-defense forces in the region or globally under very specific conditions. Prior to that, it would only happen if Japan was directly attacked. After this legislation, depending on how the government classifies the contingency or the situation, it is possible for Japan to deploy its forces if a close partner is attacked and that may threaten Japan's survival. So you can see that that's a very high bar that has to be met legally for Japan to do that. So the fact that Prime Minister Takaichi said in Parliament that they're not yet considering deploying forces, I think tells us what we need to know about what Japan is going to do. It's very difficult to picture Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces participating in operations in the Strait of Hormuz in a time of active combat. The legal hurdles are just too high.
Chris, can we talk about how the U.S. went into this Middle Eastern war pretty much unilaterally, without consultation with very key allies? A lot of them were blindsided by this particular move. So in the future, how will this actually change the dynamics of the relationship when it comes to the defense sector, and also the unpredictability versus the reliability of a partner that they had believed for so long?
Great question. I think, like Japan, South Korea is very reluctant to expand their military reach into the Strait of Hormuz or anywhere really very far away from the peninsula. So I share the skepticism about anyone from South Korea wanting to jump on board with that particular offer. But there is a very interesting issue that's been thrown up by the unilateral nature of the attacks on Iran. South Korea very strongly prefers to believe that it will be consulted in any kind of military contingency involving North Korea, right? As we saw in 2017, there was a feeling that the Trump administration wanted to give North Korea a bloody nose, was the phrase used at the time, and that South Korea would be, under the Moon administration, would be very reluctant to participate in any such thing, but would be able to effectively veto it on the basis that US bases in South Korea would not be used for any such effort. These attacks on Iran give South Korea reason to think about whether that remains the case, whether the United States would consult with its South Korean ally, or whether it would simply, sort of in the words that Donald Trump used in a different case, would simply launch its attacks from aircraft carriers in the Sea of Japan instead. Right? So South Korea's feeling that it ought to have and does have some kind of veto power over what happens between the United States and North Korea, which, by the way, North Korea hates South Korea thinking, but that's a separate issue. The fact that South Korea has felt this for a very long time has been called into question by these attacks. And that does give another issue within the alliance dynamic that needs to be seriously considered by Seoul.
Absolutely, because things right now are moving fast and furious, and obviously you have a lot of countries who are now starting to question how should they perhaps move on this relationship with the US, and that is not going to stop with this particular war. Georgi, I would like to bring you back here to talk about this support that the Philippines is asking from the United Nations Security Council to sit as a non-permanent member. That raises a lot of eyebrows, obviously, and President Marcos Jr. has said that Manila is ready to, in his words, help calm voices of division, provide a voice of balance, and to play a peacemaker role as a middle power. So how should we really read into this in seeing Philippines move away and wanting to have this non-permanent seat on the UNSC?
Yeah, so I think that was a very interesting speech that President Marcos actually gave last week at the UN, if I'm not mistaken. So the election will be either, well, it will be the Philippines or Kyrgyzstan, and probably early June we will know whether Manila will be successful. I think primarily it is, of course, this position gives Manila, it's a good avenue for diplomacy to not only stand by the importance of international law, the rules-based order at a time of crisis, but also it coincides, I think, with the deeper history of the Philippines. Because if we look at Marcos's speech, he really stressed very universal points, probably wanting to appeal to other countries. He spoke about the Philippines being the bridge between the global north and global south. Most would probably know that the Philippines has a history of colonialism, yet it believes the content of the world as it has been during the Cold War era, and it emphasizes the importance of law at a time of complications. And President Marcos highlighted the various wars that we're now seeing, and that the Philippines should do a contributing step towards discussing and advancing possible resolutions of conflicts, simply because the country had this experience itself. So in his speech, he also explained about the Mindanao Peace Agreement. He highlighted the importance of women in peacemaking that also occurred in the Mindanao peace process. And he also shared that the Philippines has many challenges, like the Pacific countries, especially about socioeconomic development, but also being vulnerable to climate change. So actually, that speech was, I think, a very good application, but it is also a clear message that the Philippines plays an important diplomatic role, because right now it is also the chair of ASEAN. It handles multiple crises, and I think that is essentially the very interesting pitch for diplomacy.
We had started off the conversation by talking about the competition between the two big powers of the world today, between China and the US. And Huong, I'd like to find out, obviously we have talked about also the upcoming meeting at the end of this month, even though nothing has been confirmed by the Chinese. But what exactly are we expecting, or what can we expect out of this? And obviously the Middle East crisis is not going to be left out of the conversation for the two leaders if they were to meet by the end of this month.
Yes, so at the risk of being highly speculative and forecasting the future, this is certainly a meeting that everybody pays great attention to, given how both leaders embraced the language and promises of multiple meetings across this year and in near future, prompting many to think about a scenario of so-called G2, something that certainly allies would be highly worried about. We talk about, in every alliances, we talk about the two fears, which is the fear of abandonment or fear of entrapment. But under President Trump, I would say we need to add a third fear, which is a fear of being on the menu, as Prime Minister Kani had said. And I think this may be not rational and highly speculative, but at the back of everybody's mind, it is indeed whether the embrace of President Xi Jinping and President Trump may result in some sort of compromise at expense of allies and partners. This is something I think it is shared across in different ways and in different variation, but across the board. I think primarily not necessarily as giving away certain territory or other pieces of interests, but what would compromise and may have a long-term detrimental effect for everyone is a compromise on so-called rules-based order. I know everybody has their own views on that, but if compromises are on well-accepted rules of the road, so to speak, guardrails, I can never pronounce that word, but it will confuse the allies, set bad precedents, and also just confuse their own foreign policy doctrines. You heard Matt starting with the free and open Indo-Pacific that the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe promoted, but it was embraced across the region, also to a different degree, but also it is become something that all countries, despite their different sizes, interests, and the way they conducted their foreign policy, could more or less agree on. And so the conversations between President Xi Jinping and President Trump that may further erode that would be something that allies and partners be highly worried about. Before the Iran escalation, I think everybody expected that this conversation between the two world's biggest leaders will be more heavily focused on the trade compromises and trade negotiations and tariffs. This is no longer to be given. I think it is very, as Comfort started with her remark, a very important timing, but also could be very awkward timing as well, given the demands that President Trump expressed, at least on social media, expecting foes and friends equally to show up at the Strait of Hormuz in that regard. So I think everything is up really if that meeting happens. If it happens, I think in both interest of Beijing and Washington is to go away from it with wins that they can both claim, so there will be some sort of compromise. But also I think a fair deal of awkwardness that may happen. I will borrow my colleague's phrasing that if the pressure that President Trump's continues, especially on allies, it would really put the test to the alliance relations, a moment of truth whether countries like Japan, Australia, and South Korea and others will actually feel obliged to respond to his requests.
Thank you. I think you're right in saying nothing is a given today, and obviously we've seen the global world order become ruptured. And going forward, I think there's a lot more uncertainties, not just in the political landscape, in the military defense landscape, but also in economic landscape. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, and the speakers here talked about the balance of power to fend off China's growing dominance, the economic security, using tariffs now to somewhat be used as a leverage to move countries to certain actions, whether or not allies have a say in the future if the US takes a decision, and what do respective nations need to do to prepare themselves. I'm going to open up the floor very soon to questions. Obviously, I know a lot of you have burning questions. Before I do that, I would love you to kindly state your name, obviously the organization that you represent, and also preferably to decide who you want to direct the questions to. But before all of that, I would like to ask Comfort a question, given the fact that she's here, so we have to tap on her expertise as well. The latest, obviously, we talked about America's Board of Peace. That's a very controversial organization as well, in parallel to the United Nations. And what we're seeing is countries are either opting to join the Board of Peace or holding back and saying that they're not ready. And interestingly, we've seen the likes of Mongolia, El Salvador joining the Board of Peace. And within ASEAN as well, you've got 3 nations out of the 11 nations, such as the Philippines, Cambodia, and Vietnam, sitting on this board. So when you talk about this Board of Peace, is that going to further segregate the countries and force countries to make a more definite choice between the US and others?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. First, thank you for your moderation of the session and the very pointed questions you asked the colleagues. Look, I think the jury is still out on the Board of Peace. I mean, let me frame my remarks in this way. I think, in a sense, when President Trump came into power for his second term, I mean, he didn't hide the fact that he was interested in the idea of peace. And, we're on record for saying that he's been quite unorthodox and iconoclastic in his approach. And, within the first few months, we saw him sort of push the door open on Gaza, but we also saw the backsliding on Gaza. And to the surprise of all of us, we didn't expect the US to show any sign of interest, for example, in Africa. So we were quite surprised by his engagement, for example, in the Great Lakes region as well. And, I think about somewhere like Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Trump Train for Peace or Prosperity Plan. And in a sense, some doors that we didn't expect to see open have been opened as well. So I think we've got to also acknowledge where credit, lay credit where credit is due, because it's not as though there was necessarily a good news to be told before President Trump came to power, especially when we're looking at developments in Gaza as well. And the developments in Ukraine, we're not going in the right direction. And we're also on record in saying that for Crisis Group, it didn't matter who opened the door to negotiation in Ukraine and whether it was Trump talking to Putin first. What matters for us was to begin the path towards some kind of ceasefire and negotiations, and we're far from there right now. So I think let's just put that on the table. But quite frankly, the real test now is going to be Gaza. That was the original idea of the board of peace, and we were surprised. I was in Davos when the president announced the board of peace. We were quite surprised by the extent, the expansion of the idea of the board of peace. Those who signed up to the board of peace in the end, and a number of Arab Muslim countries signed, and you've mentioned some of them, did it because they were focused on Gaza and because they were concerned about Gaza. They also had other interests. They used it, they see the board of peace as bringing them potentially closer to President Trump. But the real test will be Gaza. But the other big test now, I'm afraid, is going to be Iran. Because as Iran escalates, as that conflict escalates, it's going to be very hard to concentrate minds on Gaza. And those countries that have signed up to the board of peace, that are implicated in Gaza, are also fighting now for their own survival in relation to what is happening in Iran as well. So there's a legitimacy test, but the biggest test also, so there's a legitimacy test, but the other side of the ledger is, I'm afraid, there's a real test for the future of multilateralism. Because the message also is that this is pretty existential for the United Nations and for multilateralism writ large. Because one of the things that President Trump did challenge the UN to, or did question the UN about, was where were you in these 8 peace processes that I had sort of instigated as well. So it's a massive challenge to the UN at a time when it's facing a liquidation crisis, at a time where a number of people are increasingly questioning its relevance, at a time also where, quite frankly, we are facing a major decision point with a new leadership come October with a new Secretary General as well. So we are likely to see more fragmentation, but it's a half cup full, not half cup empty, because regardless of the board of peace, it will not have the same universality as the United Nations. It will not have the same infrastructure that the United Nations has. And quite frankly, in the end of the day, you're going to need some kind of multilateral body to do the big legwork, regardless of what a president decides to do. He's going to need some kind of multilateral structure. But I'm afraid that the big test is going to be Gaza, and that may have been knocked out of the way because of what's happening right now in Iran as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the floor is now open to all your burning questions. If you might want to step up to the microphone at the back, please state your name as well as the organization that you represent, and also preferably who you want to direct your questions to. Please go ahead.
Hello, Sebastian Berger from AFP. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Very interesting to hear Comfort putting the balancing case, possibly even the pro case for the Trump presidency just now. I'm curious, what do you think that the damage from your conversations with the US allies in the region and so on, do you think that the damage that Trump has wrought on the United States' reputation as a reliable, trustworthy, consistent partner is permanent, or is it going to be over in 3 years? And the question, I think, is for Comfort, and any one of the panel who wants to join in.
I think some of my colleagues has started answering that question. I mean, I think, look, if we're frank, I think a lot of damage is being done as we speak. I mean, whether it's in Latin America or Africa or Asia, I think a number of countries are now increasingly alarmed and skeptical about what a number of them see as a war of choice. And also, I think the trust deficit for some of the Gulf actors, particularly, who often looked at the US as a guarantor, are now raising questions about, watching this, are now raising questions about the reliability of the United States going forward. So this is a testing time for the US. But I will say one thing, and I'll defer to my colleagues. We're not, at Crisis Group, we're not declinists in terms of the US. We still see the US as being a relevant player on the international stage. I think the last year alone has proven that. For good and bad, it can play an important role, as and it also can be an awkward partner, and also for a president of peace. And I did take, and I still do take President Trump seriously as wanting that legacy. But when you mount a war of choice that his rippling effects, now you can't put it back in the Pandora's box. What are you then? The chaos or the harm that you inflict on a number of your allies becomes the real challenge. And the high cost now, energy prices, just coming from India, for example, and it's pretty glaring what the immediate impact is for a country like India, who's having to sort of play somersaults in negotiating with Iran. We've seen it with the Gulf countries as well. So this is quite an unpredictable moment and very uncertain for a number of allies who themselves are questioning how they manage both domestic politics, but having learnt that you can't always acquiesce, also how to manage their relationships with the United States, because they can't wish the US away given its outsized role as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say something about that. I think some of my interlocutors in Japan look to their experience in the first Trump administration, where Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was able to handle Trump relatively well. I mean, not without some cost, but in the scheme of things, relatively well. And I think before the second Trump administration started, a lot of Japanese analysts and strategists thought we're well positioned to deal with another Trump administration. That said, I mean, there's always been a strain of thinking in Japan that Japan needs to have greater strategic autonomy as something befitting a country of its economic prowess, and that it should get some distance from the United States. We're not seeing in overt terms, efforts to do that yet. In Japan, they talk about Plan A for their security. Plan A is doubling down on the alliance with the United States, but again, it's predicated on the United States that stands for a rules-based international order. What we don't see is Japan thinking seriously about accommodating a Sino-centric order in the region. So again, they're doing things to build up their own capacity, but that's not going to substitute for the alliance in the near term or the medium term. And I think some are still thinking, it's just a few more years and things will go back to normal. But I think given how wild a ride the second Trump administration has been so far, it's really going to lend greater impetus to internal debates in Japan about how much strategic autonomy is appropriate for Japan and how to achieve it. But again, I don't expect them to be speaking loudly about that.
Maybe I just quickly jump in because that is a theme that cuts really across all the reports in the series, is that whether, the allies can weather the Trump storm. I think the common conclusion is that, or common hope is that alliance will survive the Trump storm. The question is what kind of America, what kind of the world is left after Trump second term. I think like Japan, across the region, among allies, most trusted and closely shared intelligence, there is a level of surprise in terms of how decisions are made and in terms of how allies not only are not consulted, but also the decisions that are overt attack to, again, this rules-based international order. Many have said that Trump is just a symptom rather than really a root cause. But the conversation, even if peripheral, even if they're not the preferred type of conversation about potential own nuclear capability in Japan or South Korea, is no longer the taboo, is no longer unthinkable scenario. The unthinkable scenario is that can we leave, can we be okay without U.S. security assurance? The preference is that we still have that, but if the price is too high or too hard to reconcile with who they are, then this conversation needs to happen, and it's already happening. I mean, the need for everyone to talk about their self-sufficiency, self-reliance is not going to go away. Countries, we're not necessarily predicting U.S. decline, but U.S. will be a different U.S. after Trump. So alliances will also have to reflect that. The trust is severely damaged, and once hit twice shy or something like that. So I don't think that fear is going to go away easily, even if we have a next administration that is supportive and embracive of alliances.
Please go ahead.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. Philip Sherwell, a journalist and club member. Ahead of the
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you like to say your name and who you represent?
I just said Philip Sherwell. I'm a freelance journalist.
Okay.
Still. Ahead of the Trump-Xi meeting and the talk of potential compromises, grand bargains even, there is this speculation, shall we say, certainly analysis that possibly Xi could be emboldened on Taiwan, his long last outstanding sort of goal and dream for his presidency. Just interested, the U.S. alliances with these with the island chain countries that you represent or cover has always had a strong focus on Taiwan. How are the countries you're in, particularly maybe Manila is the closest, but also from East Asia, how are they viewing the prospect that Xi could be emboldened to move on Taiwan and that Trump might be willing to, I don't know, turn blind eyes or step aside in return for other interests being met?
All right, so maybe let me just start with that one. I think at least in the Philippines, one side of the coin is that this conversation about Taiwan is happening. It's not completely ignored anymore, but we still don't have clear answers. And that goes both for the Philippines as well as the understanding of the United States that ultimately, do we want to pressure Manila to answer that question, or are we for now just winging it and working together whilst implicitly understanding we need to be ready potentially for a contingency? I think our report covers it in some part, but the interesting difference that we've really observed that around 2024, people were, even notwithstanding the US role and so forth, were actively saying in the Philippines, we cannot only look to the West, because if we only focus on the South China Sea, we are vulnerable elsewhere. And that is also coinciding with that policy line or this attempt to understand the country as a truly archipelagic nation, which means you cannot focus on the West and ignoring the northern flank. We don't know what will happen in future, but it's good to be ready in any case, which is why the Philippines has already started on its own boosting part of its northern naval detachment and so forth. People are discussing the possibility of a cross-strait scenario, but it's a very complicated question, and there's still no clear answer for that, because the ultimate, issue that Manila needs to face is, what if the United States will request, these bases that are currently, there, 3 of them in the north? What will the Philippines say if we request for support to offensive operations or something like that? That is the biggest elephant in the room. Before, that conversation was anathema. Now at least people are wondering about this, and I think in the Philippines it also coincides with a general, understanding of interweaving influences. The role of the U.S. that so far has not treated the U.S.-Philippine alliance as borderline critical, archipelagic consciousness, but also the need for this agency that everybody would then also ask for. Because the Philippines has been consistent in also saying that we do what we do out of our own volition. The ally is important, but we are vulnerable in many places. And we need to find the best policy mix to basically reduce that vulnerability. And that increasingly means we need to talk about the North.
Until not very many years ago, the tendency in South Korea was to, and I mean this at the public level as well as at the elite level, to consider only the Korean Peninsula. South Korea needed to defend against North Korea. US forces, Korea was there as a tripwire against North Korea. In my recent time in South Korea, and in some interviews I've also done with media and others, it is clear that in the media and in some quarters in politics, there is now recognition that South Korea cannot escape entrapment, is one way to put it, contribution, participation in any kind of conflict that might erupt, not just over Taiwan, although that's a great example, but also elsewhere in the region. So that is definitely changing. There's an interest in changing public opinion to recognize that the threats South Korea faces are multifaceted, broader in geographical scope, and need to be taken into account as they prepare for the future. Of course, that doesn't mean that the North Korea issue is off the table, and it doesn't mean that beneath the North Korea issue there's not an awareness that China is presenting a threat not only over Taiwan, but also much closer in the Yellow Sea/West Sea, shared, jointly managed, in theory, area of the West Sea. But in general, yes, there has been a stark change over the past few years. How well that filters down to the general public is a matter of discussion, but there is an interest and a sense of urgency that public opinion about what constitutes a threat to South Korea ought to and must change.
Very quick 2 points on that. First is that President Trump keeps saying that allies should shoulder more responsibility of own security, own regional security. Matt quoted previous Prime Minister of Japan, who said, referred to the Ukraine as, Ukraine of today can be East Asia tomorrow, and by East Asia, I'm sure everybody had the same thing in mind, which is Taiwan contingency, and this is also the case that we've studied across all the reports. It is a question to allies individually. Can they live with a region where might is right? Can they afford not to get involved? A part of being called upon from using the facilities and bases and whatnot. Can they have this choice, actually? And the second thing I think you emphasize is that do not underestimate how the Taiwanese feel as well about all of that. I think Trump has successfully really put doubts in the Taiwanese people's mind whether U.S. is reliable, whether it will indeed come to its defense. And that plays out very well for Beijing in the long term, because Beijing's ultimate goal is to win without fighting. So if that confusion, mixed messages, just amplify the doubts and anxiety within Taiwanese. It will eventually result in, weakening their own resolve, which will play well to Beijing's hand at the end of the day.
Yeah, and when you talk about reliability, obviously we've seen how the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, angered China by saying that she wants to actually send in Japan into defending Taiwan. And so I think there was a lack of response by the Americans to somewhat back her up on that. So let's move on to the next question, if there's someone else.
Hello, my name is Francis. I'm an independent researcher focusing on academic freedom and civil society in Southeast Asia. My question is about, I guess, the language used to describe, the current conflicts. Just a few years ago, then there was a lot of, the term multipolar versus unipolar world that was very popular just a few years ago, and that seems to be what the discussion today about the US's evolving role in the world is. Why do you think that the discourse around unipolar versus multipolar world has seemed to disappear? Do you think it's because there has been some implicit resolution about this, or what is, in your view, has been the change from the discourse just a few years ago to today? Thank you.
Is there someone in particular you'd like to direct the question to?
Not really.
All right, the floor is yours.
I'm happy to take it. No, I think unipolar moment, I think largely is agreed even among allies to be gone. In fact, even the current Trump administration also in official language have admitted that. I mean, Secretary Rubio also embraced the term of multipolarity. The world is changing, and US as well has to adapt to multipolarity. This is a way of actually deflecting the responsibility of the global security for the current administration, right? Multipolarity is a way that perhaps speaks to MAGA's ears, that give a pass for US, the responsibility of the global policemen. But of course, this is before the Iran and before the escalating Middle East conflict. I think the main issue I take with multipolarity, even though I've written about that and advocated earlier about that, is that we have very different understanding of multipolarity, and multiple definitions of multipolarity, and nobody has agreement on the responsibilities, sharing of burdens, and of sustaining which pillar of who are the pillars of those multipolar. I think multipolarity can be very messy. Before unipolarity or bipolarity in the Cold War, historians will tell you that the world was multipolar, and we saw many regional wars. And that's actually something that I've warned against, even though many claim that multipolarity is preferred, because that, especially, for example, narrative in Southeast Asia, because that gives them a way out of choosing between US or China, and that multipolarity was a synonym of being neutral and non-committed. So I said, be careful what you wish for, because indeed we may be in an era of multipolarity where festering regional wars will only amplify the disorder. So I think the discourse that you are referring to, the change of it, is also a reflection that governments don't have it fully thought through, that the contest for dominance and primacy, even regional, not only global, is still up in the game. So multipolarity is perhaps an easy way, and it's often confused or intentionally conflated with this, the period between shifting orders. We are not in any fixed order. The old order has died. We are in the time of new order hasn't emerged, and to borrow Singaporean foreign minister saying we are in the time of monsters. So if you conflate monsters, you have multipolarity.
Hello, two questions from former Foreign Minister Kasit Pirom in the back. The first one is, will Japan eventually go nuclear? And the second one is, should Thailand take the approach of non-aligned? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the second question, please?
Should Thailand take the non-aligned route?
Okay, on the first question, my impression is that every time, I mean, there's a greater debate in Japan now about the possibility of acquiring nuclear weapons, but that every time it's studied by political parties, by think tanks in Japan, the consensus seems to be that it's too expensive and too destabilizing, and that the more practical and responsible path for Japan is to try to maintain the extended deterrence from the United States and to work on its conventional military capabilities. And I don't think that is going to change in the near term, but as I said before, if there's more discussion in Japan about strategic autonomy, obviously having nuclear weapons is the ultimate plan B if the alliance isn't working out. And it's my understanding that it's quite feasible for Japan to do something they could do in relatively short order. But I still don't see the context or the circumstances pushing Japan to that step in the near term. I think if for any reason South Korea were to do so, I think Japan might then feel some impetus to do so as well. Should Thailand be non-aligned? That's a question for Thai people to answer. Obviously, Thailand is still an ally of the United States, but I think of it as a sort of a vestigial alliance. And I think for the time being, it seems to serve Thailand's interests adequately.
Thank you. And we'll have one final question as we are running out of time, but please go ahead.
Great. Paul Risley, United Nations consultant. A quick follow-up question to the one that Matthew just handled. For both Chris and Matthew, is Korea developing a nuclear-powered submarine? Trump seems to think so, and that it's going to be built in Philadelphia, of all places. And on that, if Korea is building that capacity, certainly Japan must be considering it as well. And I would make an argument that that is a necessary first stage toward acquiring a weapon that would fit suitably very well. And remember, last week was the second use of a nuclear submarine in sinking a ship on the high seas. So very strange. And then the question that I would like to ask is what Comfort was getting at earlier, that the next 6 months represents a chance for the world to appoint one person whose sole job is preventing war and shaping peace in the selection of a new United Nations Secretary General. And it really can be anybody, right? And every previous Secretary General has essentially been plucked from obscurity. And it generally has tended to be ex-foreign ministers and retired people, and people really beyond their cell date. So I'm asking the panel, and also Comfort, if you're picking up any words from foreign ministries in the countries where you work, this is the perfect role for somebody from a middle country. This is what Korea did experience with Ban Ki-moon, not necessarily a great example, but for all the countries, this is a way that Japan, Australia, and others could step up their game. And it's also, unfortunately, a job that will be chosen by Xi, Putin, Trump, so not necessarily democratic nations, and then Keir Starmer and Macron, presumably, if Macron still has a job for the next 6 months. So it really could be anybody who's got a good resume and can send it to one of these 5 people. And we don't want the president of Kazakhstan to get the job. So what we do need is somebody who's experienced at world affairs, knows how to talk, and is a good negotiator. And I'm looking at Comfort. On that. So please.
Thank you. I should say we work together in Freetown and also the UN mission in Liberia. So it's nice to see everywhere I go, I always bump into somebody that I know. So it's nice to see you again. Look, Crisis Group is on record in 2024 to say that although we know it's Latin America's term, because there is an understanding within the UN Security Council about the regional rotation of these things, and also there is a clarion call that it should be a woman this time as well. I was fortunate enough to be at the Global Women's Leaders meeting in the start of this year, and full disclosure, our co-chair Susanna Malcora with Helen Clark was a founder of that, but they were clear that they didn't want just any woman. So it's not a matter of adding a woman and stirring and hoping for the best. They wanted somebody who was courageous, and notions about merits only pop up when the subject of women come up as well. So, but I'll set that aside. What matters to Crisis Group is precisely what you were alluding to, that person must be focused on prevention, preventative diplomacy. That whenever leader talks to you about the UN going back to basics, that is back to basics. It's about preventative diplomacy. So when we are looking at your CV, when we're looking at your, we don't have an opinion as to the makeup of that person or the region. What matters for us is that they're focused on preventative diplomacy at a time where we are in desperate need of it, where 60 wars and rising throughout the world, where we're seeing escalation and the human cost of conflict. That has to be the singular focus. So that person must be able to do it. Don't judge that person on anything else, but can they do the job today that is so desperately needed, that somebody is focused on prevention, which is cheaper than coming after and coming to try and do the firefighting, which costs you more as well. Sorry.
Anyone else? Would anyone else like to answer this before we close the session?
Well, we have a question on Japan and Korea to answer as well. Is South Korea building a nuclear-powered submarine in Philadelphia? That is the agreement, such as it is. Similarly, is South Korea acquiring an additional level of uranium enrichment capability? That is something else that in meeting at APEC in Gyeongju with President Trump, agreement was ostensibly reached. The realities of the working level process on both counts suggest that there may not be complete alignment between the White House and those tasked with implementing the decisions reached at these meetings. This also goes to the question of whether South Korea will acquire nuclear weapons. Matt said that unless South Korea acquires nuclear weapons, in effect, he doesn't think Japan is going to do it anytime soon. So evidently, Seoul's decision in this regard is extremely important. And clearly, even the Trump White House recognizes that there are grave risks to proliferation in this way throughout a region that we're here today to talk about, because it is seeing such extensive military modernization and is such a central location for the geopolitical change of our day. So,
nothing to add.
he has plenty to add.
So that's a yes or a no?
It's a maybe.
Right? Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us here today. I'd just like to let you know that the recording of this event will be available later on the Crisis Group YouTube channel, as well as on their website, www.crisisgroup.org. Please join me in thanking this panel of experts, including Comfort over here, who answered many questions, for a very insightful session today. Thank you all for coming. And you can stick around and speak to them later as well.
I'd also like to thank May for fantastic moderation. So on behalf of all of us, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the minor hiccup.